I taught archaeology at a small university. This was not a well-paid position and I did not have tenure, so it was not secure. I did have my own office, but this was nothing to be proud of. My office used to be a storage room. It was where the janitor left their mops, buckets, rags, and bottles of detergent. I knew this because sometimes the janitor forgot the storage room had been moved. He would walk into my office, look surprised when he saw me, and then smile and say sorry. It was an easy mistake to make. I told him not to worry about it and then went back to planning lessons, marking papers, and writing proposals for archaeological projects. Leading successful projects and writing articles on the findings for publications in academic journals was the only way that I could see to stop my career from flatlining. Funding was always tight though, and I was having no success until I spotted a new opportunity. I was on a forum for archaeologists, skimming through posts from much more successful colleagues about their new book or the exciting discoveries that they had made in exotic locations, when I saw a post from a mining company. It was an invitation to submit proposals to study a site of historical interest in Alaska and write a report on the findings. The local authorities in Alaska required the report before they would issue a permit to drill on the site. There was a lengthy briefing document attached to the post that included background on the site itself. Panner's Creek was a settlement that sprung up in 1890. It housed miners who had traveled to Alaska to make their fortunes in gold. There were descriptions of around 50 men and women living in the town by the fall of 1893. Something had happened over the winter of 93 to 94 while the town was cut off by the bad weather though. A trader reported that he had passed through Panner's Creek in the spring and it seemed to be deserted. The trader did not linger. He could not carry out business in an empty town. There was no explanation given for the abandonment in the documents that existed from the time. My scratch theory was that the people of Panner's Creek had simply moved on to chase a better life elsewhere. Rumors of a new strike of gold could uproot hundreds of people overnight in those days. Back in the here and now, no one from the mining company had been to the site in person yet. But the briefing document included satellite photos showing a small cluster of surviving buildings in a clearing in the woodland, and notes on AI-generated geothermal surveys, which indicated the area was potentially rich in mineral deposits. The archaeological work couldn't be done from a distance in the same way though. It would have to be carried out on the ground to create the lasting detailed record required. It all sounded good to me. I went to get a cup of black coffee with 3 sugars from the machine in the corridor and then got to work putting my proposal together. I made sure that I kept the costs very low as I was convinced that more experienced archaeologists from more prestigious institutions would also be throwing their hats into the ring and I needed to undercut them. With the document finished, I crossed my fingers, pressed send and then went home, zapped a TV dinner and fell asleep watching an old, scary movie. The days that followed dragged on. It was almost the end of term and a lot of the younger students' thoughts were clearly turning to beaches and summer vacation. By the Friday of that week, they had stopped turning up for lectures altogether. I was feeling very sorry for myself as I trudged back to my office. I slumped into the chair and checked my emails. There was nothing that I even wanted to open until I saw an email from the mining company. I clicked on it and moments later I was punching the air and saying, yes! They had accepted my proposal. The days that followed me e-signing the contract were a whole different ballgame. I raced through the academic admin that I had left to do before term ended and I prepared for the project. I signed out the equipment that I would need from the archaeology department, arranged the transport and recruited 4 assistants. These were all older postgraduate students. They would work for free to get credits on their studies. With everything that I could think of arranged, I stuffed the last of my clean clothes into a rucksack on the morning of our departure. I was excited by the challenge ahead, and even the prospect of a week on the road, crammed into a van loaded with equipment and boisterous students, did not dim my enthusiasm. It did not take long, though, for me to wish that I was back in my office or lying on my sofa watching a late-night movie. For a start, two of the students, Jeb and Tyler, suffered from travel sickness. I had no idea why they hadn't told me this before we set off. By the time that they had their heads buried in sick bags, it was too late to turn around. The other two students, Matt and Ben, and me, well, we just had to put up with the sound and the smell of the retching. And then there was the vehicle that we were traveling in. Although it drove well enough, there was a strange rattling noise coming from under the hood. None of us were mechanically minded and had no idea what was making the noise, so the rattling went on. Like a dripping tap, it started to get on my nerves. When we pulled up for the night at one of the motels that I had booked, the silence when I turned the engine off was such a relief. But when I was alone in my room and closed my eyes to try and sleep, the rattling sound started up again in my imagination. A few nights into the trip, I was so tired that I fell asleep anyway, and then I woke up a couple of hours later to scratch an itch and roll over and try to get back to sleep. Only my skin was itching too badly. I sat up and turned on the bedside light and pulled the covers away to see an angry red mark on my chest. It was too big to have been from a bed bug, but it was from some kind of insect. Cursing, I got out of bed and got undressed so that I could have a shower. I noticed when I did that I had another half a dozen bites on my body. The dang room was infested, I figured, and I stepped into the shower. I turned the faucet and there was a rattle in the pipes, and a spurt of cold water and nothing else. The sink was equally useless, and I sat on the edge of the bed, fuming and trying not to scratch my bite marks because I knew that would only make the irritation worse. One morning finally came and it was time for me to get back behind the wheel of the van. The bite marks felt worse anyway. From the relaxed, well-rested expressions on their faces, none of the students looked like they had a visit in the night from creatures with too many legs and sharp mandibles. Just my luck, I thought, and I turned the ignition. The engine resumed its rattling. For the last few days, we had been passing truck stops in small towns at the side of the road at fairly irregular intervals, and I was thinking that I would stop as soon as I could to get some cream to treat the bites. But there were no signs of any buildings that day. We were driving instead through a landscape that was dominated by trees and distant hills. Snow still covered many of the peaks. Finally, we pulled into the isolated town of Middleton. It was the nearest town to the site that we would be studying. The signs as we drove in said that there was a population of 200 and that they appreciated careful drivers. The plan had been to stock up on supplies of food and other basics in town before we traveled on. But dusk was close and I didn't think it was a good idea to drive in the dark in what felt to me like the middle of nowhere. With a final, shuddering rattle from the engine, I parked up outside of a bar. My internet searches before setting off had told me that there was a general store in Middleton, but there were no hotels as far as I knew. Hoping the bar had some spare rooms where a handful of weary travelers could hole up for the night, we went in. The students were all over 25, and I had decided that if they wanted to drink as well, then I wasn't going to object. I definitely wanted at least one drink, but first I needed to see if whoever ran the bar could put us up for the night. It was still light enough outside, but it was gloomy inside the bar. A row of figures sat hunched over glasses at a long wooden bar. There were a couple of tables and a scratched, dusty floor. As I walked up to the bar, I was half expecting the drinkers to be coated with their own layer of dust. They all looked up slowly at my approach. None of them smiled or said hello. Their bloodshot eyes simply blinked a few times and then they turned back to their beers and their shot glasses. I glanced over my shoulder to check if the students were okay. They were hanging back, standing by some rickety-looking tables near the door, I figured the seedy atmosphere was making them nervous. I gave them a thumbs up and turned back to the bar. There was an old man standing behind it. Grizzled is the kindest way that I can think to describe his face. He wore a shirt with no collar that might have been white once but was now stained and streaked with dirt. He was bald as can be on top with gray stubble on his chin, and his eyes were hooded and suspicious as he looked at me. In a voice that made it sound like he had been chewing tobacco with gravel in it, he growled, "Help your friend?" The word friend had never sounded so unfriendly. I swallowed. My throat was dry and half a dozen cold beers in a row would have been very welcome at that point. "Good evening," I managed to say. "We're here on an archaeological expedition. I was wondering if you could put us up for the night at a reasonable price before we head out to Panner's Creek in the morning." The man scowled and his voice rumbled like a distant, dirty storm when he said, "You don't want to do that, friend. Panner's Creek is a bad place. There's some that say evil walks its abandoned streets." As he spoke, I was aware out of the corner of my eye that all the drinkers had turned and were staring at me. I heard one of them spit. Another muttered, "Dang fool." I had been to small-town bars before, and I knew that the drinkers liked to mock outsiders. Well, I wasn't in the mood. Anger flaring inside of me, I span around to address the drinker who I thought had insulted me and said, "Sir, I don't take kindly to being spoken to like that. And as for this talk about bad places and evil, I am a man who places his trust in facts." With my piece said, I returned my gaze to the man behind the bar and silently challenged him to say more. He didn't look remotely intimidated. He just shrugged and said, "It's a free country, my friend, and one where the dollar is king. So I'll find a place upstairs for you and your friends to sleep and serve you a beer and a burger." He showed erect teeth and what I thought was meant to be a smile before adding, "All money's to be paid up front. Cash only, friend." I didn't see that I had a choice but to get out my wallet and hand over my money. At least we would be able to eat and have a drink and get some sleep before getting out of this no-horse town and starting the job that we had come here to do. I slumped into a seat at one of the tables and I waited for my beer. And though the glass that it arrived in was covered in smears, the beer hit the spot. The burger that followed was covered with melted cheese. There was no salad in sight. It tasted delicious to me, and when the man who had served us told us the accommodation was ready, I didn't speak. I just followed him up a narrow staircase. The students might have been behind me, they might not have been. I was so tired by this point that I didn't care. I found myself in a long narrow room with roll mats laid out on bare wooden floorboards. There was a pillow and a bedsheet on each roll mat. I dragged myself to the nearest one, kicked off my boots, and crawled under the sheet. I don't remember closing my eyes, let alone falling asleep, and when I awoke, I felt so much better. I stretched my arms and yawned. The students were snoring and light was streaming through a window. I left them catching up on their sleep while I headed to the store to buy the provisions that we would need. I had been so tired the night before that I had temporarily been numb to the irritation of the bite marks, but as I walked along the main street of Middleton, I absent-mindedly scratched an itch on my arm, and then I winced in pain. I lifted my shirt sleeve up where I had scratched myself and saw my skin was swollen and inflamed. I gingerly rolled my shirt sleeve back down and made a mental note to put a cream at the top of the shopping list, and I continued down Main Street. The street was very quiet. A couple so elderly that they wouldn't have looked out of place behind glass in a museum exhibition sat on rocking chairs on a porch. A painfully thin younger man sat on the next porch along, whittling with a viciously sharp-looking blade. A dog curled at his feet. All of them stared at me openly with sneers on their faces, including the dog. I guess that the word that there were outsiders in town who intended on going to Panner's Creek had gotten around. I imagined this was a pretty juicy bit of gossip compared to the usual hot chat about who had got gout and whose drains were blocked, or whatever it was these people talked about. And I was even more eager to get out of town and away from the petty gossip and the filthy looks as I hurried inside of the store. The storekeeper was just as bad as the other townsfolk that I had encountered. He looked at me like dirt the moment that I walked into the premises. He pointed at a sign that said cash only and then kept on glaring at me. I grabbed what I needed quickly, threw notes and coins onto the counter and stomped out. I was back on the street before I remembered that I had forgotten to buy medication for my bite marks. Forget it, I told myself. I would rather burn than give that ignorant hick any more of my money. Get out of this place right here, right now. I muttered to myself and hurried back to the bar to collect the students. They were relaxed and in a chatty mood as we finally drove away from the misbegotten town of Middleton, Alaska. I felt as if my temperature was rising. I put that down to anger and figured I would be fine just as soon as we would put some miles on the clock. The road that we were on started off fine, but quickly it deteriorated from tarmac to dirt. There were ruts everywhere and the van rocked and shook as we drove. It was getting darker as well. Although it was still a bright day, the trees on either side of the track were overhanging more and more and blocking out the sunlight. They weren't part of the scenery anymore. They were soon pretty much all that we could see. And all the while, the track got narrower and more uneven, while the trees kept closing in. I was not going fast, I didn't dare, but still I felt like I was going to lose control of the van at any moment, after an axle snapped or a tire was torn open. Somehow the van stayed intact and we stayed on the track, and eventually we emerged into a clearing. I blinked in the sunlight and wiped a sweat from my eyes. My armpits, neck and back were soaked as well. I extracted myself slowly from the van and looked around. Panner's Creek stood on either side of the small, slow-moving stream which I assumed had helped give the town its name, along with a supply of fresh water. There were the remnants of a number of wooden buildings. The roofs had collapsed on most and vegetation curled through broken windows and doors. Dead leaves were scattered across the ground. There was a stillness about the place, and I wondered if we were the first people to come here in well over 100 years. If that was the case, this untouched town could prove a fascinating source of material for archaeological study. And behind me, the students were stretching out stiff limbs. They were grinning and laughing and clearly excited to be there. I put my hands together and said, "Okay, gang, let's get to work." We had brought 2 large tents, one for accommodation and one to use as a study center and storage space for the artifacts that we would find. It was early afternoon by the time that we had pitched the tents and unloaded the equipment. After taking a break for a basic meal and coffee made using a camper stove, we started creating a map of the layout of the town. Work progressed quickly and the map was sketched out well before dusk. It helped that we didn't have the distractions of messages to read or send, or websites to browse. That was my opinion anyway. I had grown up in a world where cell phones were the size of bricks and fax machines were still whirring away. The students, though, seemed frustrated at being cut off because there was no signal at Panner's Creek. Ah well, I thought, they could catch up when we made it back to civilization. But for now, we were immersed in a different age. To keep the students busy before it was late enough to sleep, I decided we could begin a basic examination of the interiors of the buildings. Using the map, I broke the town up into 4 quadrants and allocated 1 student to each. As they got to work, I peered into a couple of the nearest buildings at random. I could see the rotting remains of crude furniture in shadow-masked spaces. If the population had cleared out in a hurry, I was hoping that they would have left behind household objects and maybe even some mining equipment. They were my idea of a treasure trove. I was daydreaming about the paper that I was going to write for an academic journal after I had submitted the report, and the job offers that would flood in when one of the students called out for me. It was Ben. He was inside one of the buildings near the creek. I headed over and found the other students were already there by the time that I had arrived. As for Ben, he looked a bit pale and I wondered why, and then I saw what he had found. A bone lay on the floor. It looked to me like it was a femur and it was clearly old. Finding a human bone inside of one of the buildings was unsettling, but I wasn't concerned. I was intrigued. There would be an explanation and reasoning that was a part of our work here. I told Ben, "Hey, good work. Let's get this sample's position noted on the map and then it can be removed, bagged and given a serial number." The color had returned to his cheeks now that he had gotten over his initial shock, and as all the students got back to work, I could tell that they were buzzing with excitement. And though this was not a competition, if they were anything like I had been when I was younger, they would each be hoping that they were the one to make the next find. It was Matt's voice who called out a few minutes later, and when I saw what he had found, I felt a ripple of unease. It was a rib cage. Human again, of that there could be no doubt. For a moment, I had an instinctive urge to leave it where it was in the floor of the building. I don't know why. As I had told the man in the bar, I placed my trust in facts, and I couldn't let a bad feeling influence my actions. I cleared my throat and tried to sound enthusiastic as I told the students, "Hey, this is an excellent start. We'll mark this find on the map and then remove it together." I took the lead, carefully working accumulated dirt away from the bones before gently lifting the ribcage. "I think we can call it a night now," I said before I carried it back to the storage and study tent. But the students weren't listening to me. They headed out and they were looking into other buildings. Matt was once again the first to speak. He yelled out, "There are more of them in here, Professor. Should we mark, bag, and tag them?" I took a long breath to give myself a moment to calm down before replying. "They've been there for more than half a century. They can wait until the morning." And the night that followed was one of those that feels like it will never end. The effects of the refreshing sleep that I had had the night before were all gone. I was shattered and strung out. My bite marks were throbbing and itching incessantly as well, and I felt way too hot and was soon coated in fresh sweat. So no matter how much I tried to get comfortable, I just couldn't seem to get to sleep. The minutes and the hours dragged by. It was pitch dark outside, but it was not silent. There were leaves rustling in the wind, which on their own would have been fine, but I could also hear branches cracking as something moving through the woods broke them underfoot. And there were things crying out, howls that rose and fell in the night. It was just the local wildlife, I had told myself, nothing to worry about. But I was a city slicker and my nerves were already stretched tight. I lay there listening, trying to work out what the latest noise was. Finally, light had started to creep into the tent as dawn broke. I decided to give up trying to get to sleep. I would get up and go wash my face and clean my teeth in the stream and then make an early start. I had notes still to write up from the day before. I rolled over onto my side, and the next time that I opened my eyes, there was sunlight streaming into the tent and all the students were gone. Typical, I thought. After all that, I had not only dropped off, I had ended up sleeping in. I dragged myself to my feet and shuffled out of the tent. The students were already hard at work inside of the buildings. My nerves flared. They should have waited for me and they were clearly rushing. Good archaeology was always undertaken with care at a thoughtful pace. I went back into the tent to get dressed for the day and then marched back out to give them a piece of my mind. I didn't get the chance. Ben walked into the open, held up a bone and waved it around. "Hey, Professor," he said. "We've been hitting the lottery with these beauties all morning." I replied through gritted teeth. "Those beauties, as you put it, are important historical artifacts and the remains of humans. They are to be treated with respect." Hearing the edge in my voice, Ben flinched. Gee, sorry, Professor, he said. I immediately felt bad and forced myself to tone it down. That's okay, but if we can use best practice from now on when handling the things we find, that would be very much appreciated. Ben grinned and gave me a thumbs up. The others followed suit. Now working methodically, we completed the initial examination of the interiors by late afternoon. I didn't feel any sense of achievement at this. My unease of the day before had returned. We had recovered almost complete skeletal remains from around 30 people. There was no equipment to date the bones on site, but I believe they were all from the period when Panner's Creek was inhabited. If the individuals had all been there over that final winter, it meant that we had bones of around 3/5 of the total population laid out in the tent and spilling over onto the ground outside. I had a theory about what had happened to them, one that did not help my nerves. My theory was that the population had not moved on to pursue their fortunes elsewhere after all. Rather, over the winter, the animals in the district had been driven by extreme hunger to come into the settlement, attack the townsfolk, and kill and devour them. I had come to this chilling conclusion after seeing that a high percentage of the bones had teeth marks in them. Whatever had attacked had stripped flesh from bone and then bitten into the bone itself. The people whose remains that we had found must have died in terror. The others, I guessed, must have escaped and fled at Panner's Creek forever. And when the trader arrived in Panner's Creek in the spring, he must have left without checking inside and seeing the bones. Thinking through this left me feeling sick. I sat outside of the tent, sipping boiled streamed water, wishing it was a glass of bourbon or a long cold beer, and trying to decide what to tell the students. A part of me was thinking that I shouldn't say anything to them. It wouldn't serve any purpose for me to tell them about my theory. The past posed no threat to them. But there were still wild animals out here in 2023 which were a potential threat. On the other hand, I reasoned it was midsummer, not the depths of winter, and any animals would have plenty of prey to satisfy them. We would be safe for the few days that we were going to be there. We would be safe. Hopefully. In the end, I just wasn't sure, so I decided to err on the side of caution. After our evening meal, I told the students that I was introducing some rules, because there might be wild animals out in the woods which could pose a danger. Nobody is to leave the tents after dark, I said, and while it is still light, if you need to go into the woods to go to the bathroom, make sure that you're not alone. Matt was the first to pull a face. We're not stupid teenagers, he said. I counted to 10 before replying. I know that, but as your teacher, I have a duty of care. Please just do what I'm asking of you. The four of them shared looks and seemed to be considering. Finally, Matt said, "Whatever," which sounded to me like a very teenage thing to say, but I kept this thought to myself. I nodded instead and said, "Good, now let's try and get some rest. I want us to start excavating sections of the soil tomorrow. There may be important artifacts buried near the surface." But hopefully no more bones, I thought. Please, no more bones. Though it was still light, everybody started getting ready to turn in. Ben and Matt set off towards the woods together, and I was glad to see that they were following the rules. I could hear them moving through the woods after I lost sight of them, and then there was silence. A silence that was broken minutes later by a cry of horror. I shot to my feet, fearing the worst. It sounded like one of the students had been attacked by a wild animal, and I had to act now to save them, if there was still even time. With my pulse racing, I stumbled forwards on legs that felt like they had been turned to jello, but ground to a halt when Matt burst out of the woods. As he ran towards me, I called out, "What's wrong? What happened to Ben?" "Oh man, it's horrific. It was unspeakable, the noises, the smell." At this point, Matt gripped his nose and made like he was heaving, and Ben strolled out of the woods. He was clearly unharmed. Man, you got something seriously wrong with your guts. That was gross. And then they both collapsed into laughter. Jeb and Tyler cracked up as well. And now that my panic had subsided, I could feel my temper rising. A group of men in their 20s were acting like they were 10 years younger. I counted to 10, but that didn't help, and so I walked away. I needed some space and headed for the buildings without really thinking where I was going. Pushing away spiraling weeds, I stepped into one of the buildings. It was dark and dank. Motes of dust hung in a fading beam of sunlight which reached in through a window and illuminated a patch of the floor. Crude floorboards looked to have been laid directly onto the dirt of the ground, but something had caught my eye. There was a dark object visible beneath the gap that ran in between two of the floorboards, and it looked man-made. I knelt over, hooked a couple of fingers into the gap, and I pulled. One of the floorboards lifted to reveal a small metallic box. I should have left it in place until its position could be recorded, but I was so tired and worked up that for once I forgot about crossing the T's. I picked up the box. There was a lid but no lock that I could see, so I had to go at lifting up the lid. It was stiff with age, but with a bit of effort on my part, it creaked open. There was a leather-bound journal inside. I opened it to the first page and saw neat, handwritten text. Captivated by my discovery, I closed the journal and went to find somewhere quiet to read it. I could hear the students talking inside the tent where we slept, so I went to the study and storage tent instead. Picking my way through the laid-out bones, I found a seat, and as the last light of the day bled through the canvas, I read this. I had been too caught up in the adventures of my life in Alaska to write anything in this journal that my father bought me as a leaving present. Now, though, the rush to grow rich from gold is ground to a halt in this terrible place. It is called Panner's Creek, and it is a hell of ice and snow and unrelenting winds. I fear that I will never leave here and that this winter of 1894 will be the last that I spend on this earth. It is not the cold that fills me with increasing dread. However, it is the behavior of a number of my neighbors. We are all trapped here and starving after the provisions that we were meant to see us through to the spring ran out. Some are bearing this hardship with courage and compassion. Others are whispering dark things. They are saying that the only way to survive is to carry out an act that is abhorrent to all civilized people. Its name is cannibalism. Though the pain in my distended belly is unbearable and I grow weaker by the moment, I make a vow here in writing that I will never feast on the flesh of another human. I do not pretend to be a hero or noble, but I want my family to know that I died untainted by evil. So I'm taking care to preserve my journal by hiding it beneath the floorboards. I will do this now because I do not think that I have much longer. Those who are prepared to embrace the darkness are outside, and they are hammering on my door. I can hear the depravity and the hunger in their voices as they call for me to come out, and I know that my fate will be truly hideous. These are my last words. I closed the journal and breathed out a long, plaintive sigh. I had been right that there had been violent death here, but the rest of my theory had been way off the mark. It had not been wild animals that had stripped flesh from bone. Men and women had feasted on their fellow humans. I shivered and hugged myself. I felt feverish and overwhelmed. I just couldn't deal with this. As soon as it went light, I would tell the students that we were packing up and leaving. And when we were a long way away from this place, I would alert the authorities and they could decide what to do. I curled up into a ball and slipped into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. There was no respite for me though. What to me felt like seconds later, I was being shaken awake. It was dark outside and Matt, Ben, and Tyler were standing around me. They all held flashlights. One of the beams was pointing far too close to my eyes. I shielded myself and grunted. What is it? It's Jeb, Ben gasped. "He went into the woods an hour ago and he hasn't come back." I cursed. The terrible events at Panner's Creek years ago had been caused by humans, not wild animals. But that didn't mean the animals that prowled the woods were no longer a threat. In 2023, savagery moved on 4 legs, and I had the sickening feeling that Jeb was missing because he had been attacked by wild animals. I don't know if that was what the students were thinking. They definitely were not thinking clearly. "We need to go look for Jeb," Ben said. "We should spread out to cover more ground," Matt added. I had seen enough horror movies to know that going into the woods was the equivalent of going down into the cellar of the spooky house to search for the last victim of the masked serial killer. We would get picked off one by one. I grabbed a spare flashlight and then, putting as much authority into my voice as I could, I said, "We stay out of the woods until it goes light. Now come with me and everybody stick together." The 3 of them didn't look happy, but none of them argued at it. With them trailing behind me, I hurried to the edge of the woods and started to call out, "Jeb, are you there?" Tyler and Ben joined in after a moment, but Matt turned to me and muttered, "This is lame. I'm going back to the tents to find something to use as a weapon, and then I'm going into those woods." He stomped off. I cursed him and then turned my attention to Tyler and Ben. "We're going back to the tents, together." They both glanced back at the woods, thinking of their friend who was still out there, no doubt. I was as well, and my thoughts were racing. This situation was out of control. I started to move back towards the tents when Ben said, "Wait, Professor, I saw something moving in the woods." He had his torch pointing at a patch of trees. I stared, but I couldn't see anything. I shook my head and said, "I'm sorry, but it's safer this way, come on." Reluctantly, Tyler and Ben trailed after me. I was expecting to find Matt in the study and storage tent where there would be equipment that he could use as a makeshift weapon, but it was empty, apart from the bones of the miners that we had laid out on the ground. I thought again of how they must have died, in fear and pain, and all to sate the hunger of the people that they had called their neighbors. I told myself to snap out of it. The past was no longer my concern. All that mattered was getting through the next few hours. "Hey, Professor." I looked up to see who had called out. It was Ben. "Matt's not in our tent. Is he with you?" My grim expression was clearly the only answer that he needed. He swore under his breath. By his side, Tyler looked sick. "What's going on, Professor?" he asked. He didn't sound like a grown man or even a teenager anymore. He sounded lost and scared and small. I took a deep breath and said the opposite of what I was thinking. "It's going to be okay." Wild animals had surely got Jeb in the woods, and now Matt had gone missing from open ground, which meant the creatures were venturing out of cover, leaving me, Ben, and Tyler exposed and in mortal danger. I wiped sweat from my eyes and felt bile rise into the back of my mouth. The world spun around me. I needed to think, needed to work out what to do. An idea came to me. "We're going to the van," I said. "We'll be safe in there, and in the morning we can drive around and look for the others. And get away from here as soon as we can," I thought, but I didn't want to say that out loud. Neither Ben nor Tyler objected to my idea, and we turned together to where the van was parked. I raised my flashlight so that we could see the way. A dark form ran through the beam. It was caught in the light for scant seconds, but that was enough for me to see that it was moving on 2 legs and not 4. And I could see more figures moving between us and the sanctuary of the van. They were swift and elusive, and I couldn't get a clear look at any of them as I darted the beam from left to right. "What are they?" Ben asked. He was shaking. By his side, Tyler's face was streaked with tears. They were terrified, and so was I. Whatever the truth was here, it was more than I could face, and all I could do was keep lying. Wild animals, I answered and then added hastily. We need fire, that will keep them away. The students didn't look like they believed me, but when I grabbed the camping stove, turned on the flame, and held it against the edge of one of the tents to set it on fire, they rushed into action. Ben began to fan the flames with his jacket, and Tyler grabbed papers and added them to the makeshift pyre. Being busy beats thinking every time. Soon the flames were crackling and smoke was spiraling into the night sky. We kept throwing everything on that we had that was flammable, and I kept looking around as we did, but I couldn't see anything moving towards us. It was working, I told myself. I guess that I had fooled myself that everything was going to be okay, that this was a nightmare from which we could awake. But dawn brought me crashing back down to earth. There was no improvised fuel left and the fire had burnt itself out. The last smoke was drifting away and the horror that we were facing was revealed in the early morning light. A dozen figures encircled us. They stood upright and were clothed in torn rags. Their faces were smeared with dirt and their long hair was matted with filth. Some carried bones with them and were stripping away the last of the flesh with their yellowed teeth. This was all that remained of Matt and Jeb I knew with sick certainty, because I knew now what these things were. The cannibals of Panner's Creek did not leave in 1894. They had stayed. They must have survived on whatever they could find to eat nearby. And they had continued through the generations, hiding from the rest of the world and adding incest to their hideous sins. The figures approaching us were the inbred ancestors of the first cannibals. They were family. Their malformed, simpletons' faces were now twisted with rage as they came closer. Drool hung from their open mouths and their eyes were glazed over with their obscene lust for human flesh. For our flesh. Tyler was hyperventilating and Ben was looking around frantically. I could tell that he was looking for a way to escape, but we were surrounded by the freaks. That didn't stop him though. He sprinted forward before I could intervene. He collided with one of the family and sent them flying, but before he could take another step, more of them grabbed him and pulled him down to the ground. And then the rest of the circle of figures all streamed at speed towards the prone student and fell on him. I could see flashes of yellowed teeth biting, of long filthy fingernails gouging. I could make out Ben's arms thrashing, desperately trying to push them away, but there was nothing that he could do. He began to scream, to plead for somebody to help him, but I could only stand there frozen with terror and shame. Tyler had fallen to his knees and was starting to sob hysterically. Ben's screams grew louder and then his voice died away. The only thing that I could hear then was the crunching, slobbering, and swallowing swirl of foul noises as the family fed. And there was not enough for all of them. Those on the outskirts of the slaughter had blood splattered on their revolting faces, but their appetites still clearly raged with the need for warm human meat. They turned to look at Tyler and then me, and they began to move toward us. The blood that had been spilled had fueled their frenzy and they howled as they approached at speed. I staggered backward. Tyler tried to push himself to his feet, but he didn't make it. The family attacked him with looks of insane glee on their blood-stained and filthy faces. Tyler begged for somebody to help him, but nobody answered his pleas. His skin was stripped from his body, his muscles ripped away, his organs torn free as the family gorged. The others had reduced Ben to nothing but bone by now and they were rushing over to join in. There were squabbles and shrieks as they fought with their kin to get a last bite from the remains of Tyler. And soon he was gone as well. He was fragments, bones, and bloodstains. That was all that remained of him. And I was left standing there. A dozen pairs of eyes burning with primal hunger fixed on me. They crept forwards almost as if they were savoring my fear. One figure seemed to be taking the lead now. He was bigger than the others and a male, from the rat-tail beard which hung from his chin. The father of the family, I thought, as a hysterical laughter bubbled from my lips. I wanted to close my eyes and wish the darkness of death would envelop me in an instant, but I knew that I was about to die in a maelstrom of pain and terror. I looked at the head of the killer clan and wept. He came closer still. His breath was hot on my face. I could see the cracks in his teeth, his twisted fingernails which were sharp as blades. He placed these on my shirt and sliced downwards, exposing my skin. He was enjoying this, I could see. I was this depraved glutton's feast. Only his expression was changing. The excitement was fading, and I could see disgust in his face as he stared at my bare chest. I glanced down, and pus oozed from the wound that the bite mark there had become, and the sickly sweet stench of infection rose up into his nostrils from the wound and others that had festered over the last few days. The father of the family looked at me and growled, "You rotten, you make us sick. We no eat." And then he began to back away, and the others followed. Now and then, one of them would look back at me and its eyes would narrow, and then it would wrinkle its nose and turn away. My ordeal didn't end there. Crawling to the van and dragging myself into the driver's seat, it left me utterly drained. I started the ignition and vomited on the wheel and myself. I kept being sick as I drove and then dry heaved as the track through the woods unfolded before me. After this, I remember the trees rushing in and out of focus, and then nothing else until I came around by the side of the road, with the siren flashing on the edge of my vision and distant voices asking me for my name. I'm in a hospital now, attached to a drip and trying to get my thoughts straight before the police interview me. I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't think that they'll believe the truth. That I survived because I was bad meat.